Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here with Courtland Allen. Courtland is the creator of Indie Hackers, a community of people working together to build profitable online businesses. It was acquired by Stripe in 2017, just 9 months after he started it. And today it's been visited by over 2 million entrepreneurs. Courtland, thank you so much for taking a few minutes to talk.
Thanks, Robert, for having me on the show. Pretty excited to talk to you about Indie Hackers.
Thanks. So what is the story behind building Indie Hackers? Like why did you start it?
I think it's hard to even know where to begin that story. I could start it 10 years ago. I could start it 2 years ago. But let's do the abridged. It's a 2-year version. The reason that I started Indie Hackers is because I myself wanted to be an indie hacker. I had a long career of sort of starting and failing at startups that were backed by investors. I knew that all I really wanted for myself was some degree of financial independence. I knew that I didn't like working for other people, that I didn't particularly like working on other people's projects. I wanted my own creative freedom to do whatever I wanted, from wherever I wanted, at whatever time I wanted, for however long I wanted. And I wanted to sort of be monetarily rewarded for what I did in proportion to how good of a job I was doing. And so I just didn't really want to work a normal job, nor did I really want to be, chasing some investor's dream of billions of dollars. And so I figured my only option is to somehow build an online business using my skills. I'm a software engineer that would generate monthly revenue for me that would be enough to pay for my rent, my food, the basic things that you need to survive. The only problem was I didn't know a lot of other people who were doing this. It's not exactly something that gets published to the front page of TechCrunch. Hey, guy working from his basement doesn't have to get a job. It's not front page news. So you never really see this stuff happening. Luckily, I had been a participant of this online community called Hacker News for a very long time.
Yeah.
And Hacker News is full of all sorts of software engineers, people in the tech world, investors, founders, you name it. And probably once a month for the past 10 years, there's a discussion on Hacker News about people who were doing exactly what I wanted to do. And it would always be like, hey, what's your one-person side project? What's your profitable business? How are you escaping the 9-to-5? Something of that nature. And people would just kind of come in and every now and then tell their stories. Hey, I got this app. I'm doing this thing. And others would ask some questions. How much money are you making? Or how did you do it? Or give me a tip. I want to do the same thing.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'll go here and start reading some of these threads. And that'll give me ideas for what I should do for myself. Because there's really nowhere else online that I can find this information. About 3 days into this search, I had this very meta realization that like, hey, I'm not the only person doing this search. Yeah. There's hundreds of people in the comments asking each other questions and trying to get to the bottom of exactly how to build these businesses. And if I can take what's going on in these threads, sort of capture that magic, and then pull it out and put it on my own website and just sort of refine it and make it better and sort of make it the epitome of what it could be, then like I would have a business on my hands because I have actual customers. I know where to find them. They're on Hacker News. And I could sort of build a business off the back of that. So that's the origin story of why I built Indie Hackers. I really built it so that I could be an indie hacker.
So, I mean, it's great and all to think, okay, definitely there's this need for a community, but it's quite another thing to actually be able to create one, if that makes sense. So how did you go about that? Like growing the community in the early days, and did you assume, like, was that your biggest challenge, or was that what you thought your biggest challenge was going to be, or was it something else?
There's this I think it always gets attributed to Steve Jobs, but I'm not sure if he actually said it. Like the good artists copy, great artists steal. Sure. And that's like I think it's a saying that's just made to make people who copy things feel better about themselves. To be honest, like I had no experience building a community before. Mm-hmm. But what I did have were examples of other people building communities. Sure. And so I kind of searched to find out, okay, is there an example of someone who's done this before in the way that I want to do it? And I can literally just steal their playbook, just do exactly what they did, follow the exact steps that work for them. I don't have to sort of prove any hypotheses or like wade into uncharted territories. I'll just do what's already worked for somebody else. And there's another site that I happened across during my reading of Hacker News called Nomad List. And this guy behind Nomad List, Peter Levels, was sort of like the champion of like this whole go off and be your own indie hacker movement. Like everyone really looked up to him. He was making, I think, $50,000-$60,000 a month at the time. He was very transparent. And he would always tell the origin story of Nomad List. It started off with him sort of crowdsourcing this list of cities for digital nomads to travel to. He had a Google spreadsheet. It sort of translated that into a website. Everybody came to the website because they didn't want to do this research themselves. They just wanted to see, the research that he had compiled. Off the back of that, he started gathering email addresses and putting them into a mailing list. And he created a discourse community. Since his mailing list was so large, he could just email discussions from his discourse community into his mailing list and sort of drive traffic to his community that way and get the discussion started. Then he started doing tons of AMAs and getting high profile figures into his community to make it better for people to join. And eventually, after a lot of hard work doing that, he transformed the community from nothing into something. And so really the strategy was like start off with content that people really like. In that case, his case, it was this list of sort of information on these cities. I said, okay, I could do the same thing. I'll start off with content that people really like. I will sort of do this research, all these interviews on these companies for people so they don't have to do it, put it all in one place so they come. Then I'll get everybody on my mailing list. Then I'll create a community forum the same way the Peter Levels did with Nomad List. My approach was sort of the Reddit strategy. So I also kind of stole what Reddit did. I made a bunch of fake accounts and I was talking to myself on the forums like the first week, seeded with all these interesting discussions, and started emailing those discussions out to my mailing list. And slowly but surely, like one person, two people at a time would trickle in, create an account, start having conversations with me and other versions of me and other versions of me. And eventually they started talking to each other. And after like successive weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months of emailing out these discussions to my mailing list, the community started to take on a life of its own. And so I think it really just came down to, like, if I had to describe it strategically, is you need some way to consistently reach out to people and drive them to a community. One burst of traffic is not going to be enough. It was a months-long process of driving people back into the community before it reached some sort of critical mass where it could survive on its own.
Do you think that you could have done this from a point of view of like knowing you wanted to be an indie hacker, you wanted to create be master of your own destiny? Do you think you would have been able to do that without having gone through the experience of working for investment seeking, I don't know, wannabe unicorn type companies? Like, did that kind of give you a bit more of a fire, or had you always kind of wanted to be this kind of, I don't know, a version of yourself?
I think what gave me the fire was seeing other people do it this way. I don't think I necessarily needed the experience of doing it like the wrong way, wrong for me, not necessarily for other people. So if I go back to like college, in college, I knew I wanted to start a company. I really knew that I liked programming, liked creating things. I'd always loved creating things, whether it was board games or books or web apps, like just creating stuff from scratch is super fun to me. And the fact that you could attach a business model to something that you create and have it be the self-sustaining thing, so you can do what you love and not have to worry about getting a job, was always fascinating to me. The only problem was that like every example of anyone doing it seemed to be like a Silicon Valley high growth startup. Right? That seemed to be the path that you had to take. And so that kind of naturally ended up being the path that I was on. But pretty quickly, when I was exposed to people doing things the other way, it caught my attention. So I remember going to Y Combinator Startup School in like 2010, and Jason Fried was there speaking. And I'd never heard of Jason Fried or Basecamp. But he got on stage and he basically said, all the investors and founders you heard before me are idiots. You don't have to do it that way. You can do the way we're doing at Basecamp, and we're just making money every month, and it's great, and it works, and we're happy doing what we're doing. There's no stress, and there's no sort of begging for handouts from investors. And I was like, that sounds amazing. How do I do that? I remember I asked him a question afterwards, and I was so excited I could even just talk to him. It's like I'd never heard anyone saying that. And then it was back to the sort of dark ages, and I didn't see him again. I didn't hear anything about that kind of thing again. And if I went online to look for anybody saying that, it was like only him and his co-founder saying that. It's like they were these lone voices in the wilderness. And so I was like, I guess I can't really do that after all. Maybe there's something wrong with it. Like no one else is doing it. And then I got into Y Combinator, and kind of the same thing happened again. I would go down to these dinners at YC every week, and they would have some investor, some founder of Dropbox come talk to us about how they raised money and did all this crazy stuff. And then I would kind of be like, well, that sounds great. I guess I have to do that. And then they would bring in like one guy who would be like, actually, my company's just making money. They're running Kevin Hale from Wufoo. He's like, yeah, we did YC, then we moved to Florida. We turned down investor calls every day. We were fully remote. We profit share with our team. We're making like $5 million a year. We're super happy. Like this whole raising money thing is like, you don't have to do it if you don't really want to. So I'm like, like that's another thing. So I asked him a bunch of questions. And so I think, it was more of a constitutionally attractive thing for me to go that route. And whenever I saw any instance of that happening, it resonated with me. And whenever I saw the other path, I was still motivated because it still had a lot of things that I liked doing, but it wasn't quite where I wanted to be.
So in terms of, and I guess maybe taking on your experience, just watching a lot of these, I don't know, what you want to call it, like indie hackers that turn themselves into profitable businesses or create profitable businesses from the ground up. Are there certain kind of trends that you've seen repeatable that you might suggests that people who are interested in starting a side project, but starting it in order to make it into a sustainable business, for them to maybe either read about or look as good examples, or just thought processes or mindsets.
Yeah.
Just repeatable.
Yeah, totally. There's a ton of them. There's this guy, Charlie Munger. He's Warren Buffett's business partner. I'm a huge fan of his. He's like the wisest, best business thinker that I've ever come across. And he's really big on this principle of what he calls inversion. So instead of asking like, how do I get this thing? You should, if you want to come up with more creative answers, like occasionally ask yourself, like, how would I not get that thing? Like, what would stop me from doing this thing? And so when I look at trends that indie hackers follow to sort of build successful businesses and sort of follow this, individual bootstrapper indie path, I think of, okay, what is it that stops people from successfully doing this thing? And a lot of it is obvious in hindsight, but when you're doing it, like, you don't really realize that you're doing it. So for example, one thing that stops people is taking advice from VC funded companies or from investors, right? These people have different goals than you, therefore they have different constraints, or maybe they have fewer constraints than you have. And if you follow their advice blindly without realizing they're going to a different path, like, it might end up being bad for you. So for example, a lot of VC funded companies like to operate in winner take all markets. Like, I want to build a social network, right? I want to build like a ride sharing app that's going to completely change the world, right? That's not necessarily the best path for you to go down if you're an indie hacker, because those companies need to compete voraciously with other companies in those networks. And many of those companies are raising venture capital, and it's hard to compete with Uber or Lyft if you haven't raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Like, Lyft just filed for its IPO. I think its founders own less than 1% of the company, because in order to build that company, it wasn't just founder skill, it was like hundreds of millions of investor dollars to scale it up that quickly. And so I think founders who build successful bootstrapped businesses and self-funded businesses tend to operate more in markets where there can be healthy competition. So a good example might be the hiring market, where lots of tech companies are trying to hire developers. And guess what? There isn't just one company tackling that problem. There are hundreds of companies. In fact, there's multiple industries within that particular industry where you have recruiters and you have job boards and you have coding boot camps. Like, there's 1,000 different ways you can sort of, pick a part of this process and sort of help developers get jobs. And it's a pretty lucrative industry to be in. And the existence of one successful business doesn't mean your business will get killed, which means that you can, as an indie hacker, find a small niche foothold in that particular situation and still be a success. So I think that's one thing that I see as a commonality between successful companies. Another one is, again, inverting. Like, why do people fail? Usually it's because they quit. Very rarely is it like the government has shut you down. Some lawyers issue like a cease and desist. It's usually, sometimes it's not even because you run out of money. Sometimes it's you've still got money in the bank, but you just stop. It's usually because people quit, right? You quit because things aren't working, because you're discouraged, because the process of moving forward looks harder than the process of quitting and going to get a job. So the question is, how do you not quit? And I think one of the easiest ways to not quit, and one of the most consistent trends I see for people who succeed, is that they have a very high frequency of small wins. And so instead of biting off some huge project that's going to take you a year to get out to the public, you do something like write, a week or two of code, release your minimum product, and immediately start trying to sell it and get your first paying customer after like 2 weeks. And then you're onto something, right? And it's not your grand vision. Maybe you had to sacrifice a lot of your grand vision to get there. But now you've got, a little bit more confidence to take the next 2 weeks and go there. And so I think that's, it's apparent in the indie hacker story, right? I didn't start with the community. I started with the interviews, and then a mailing list, and then a community, and then a podcast, etc. I didn't try to do all of it at once. Peter Levels, who started Nomad List, which sort of inspired my strategy, he did 12 startups in 12 months, was what he called it. And every month he was going to start a different self-contained startup, and he's going to actually try to take it to completion and make money from it before moving on to the next one. And a lot of people would do like one startup in 12 months or one startup in 24 months, but he did 12 and 12. And as a result, he kind of kept getting these dopamine hits, and he didn't quit. And he actually was able to see the difference between a startup that was kind of a lukewarm success and a smash hit. Because I think in his 6th or 7th month, he created Nomad List, which had dwarfed the success of all his other startups. So I think he's sort of taking off small bites is another consistent trend. I could go on and on for like hours.
Yeah. Well, so the flip side is I guess when do you give up? Like so and I don't necessarily give up in general, but specifically on an idea, right? You've built that product. You put it out there. We're doing it this week, right? We're taking a product and we want it to get it from 0 to revenue in a week, and for it to be working and all that good stuff. But there must be time boxing that you have to kind of build into that to say, right, this has failed or this isn't working, I'm going to move on to the next thing. How
Yeah.
do you kind of evaluate when to pull the plug so that you can put your energies towards something else?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I see people struggle with it all the time on the Indie Hackers forum. I've struggled with it myself. Like I had an app that I worked on for like 6 or 7 years and it was sort of puttering along. The conclusion that I've come to now is that there is no right answer. Like in the infinite possibilities that exist in the universe, probably any product or idea you come up with, if you worked on it for long enough and hard enough, but examined everything you could do, you could probably make it a success. Yeah. And so what it comes down to is, what is your personal appetite? Like, what is your personal time limit in terms of resources or effort or emotion invested that you're willing to spend on making this idea work? And I think the problem that a lot of us have is that we don't know the answer to that. Like, we never really sit down beforehand, before we get started on something, and say, this is how much time I'm willing to put into this before I move on to something else. And sometimes it seems hard to do that because it seems kind of arbitrary. Yeah. Like, why do you say 4 weeks, not like 6 weeks, not 12 weeks? And sometimes you also kind of feel like, a quitter or a failure if you don't see things through to the end. There's the Airbnb guys. They spend 3 years struggling and eating ramen and selling cereal boxes. Like, am I not a founder if I don't do the same thing? I think it just comes down to your personal preference. I'll tell a short story with the app I mentioned earlier. It's called Task Force. I worked on it for like 6 years. It was always sort of puttering along. Near the end, what finally convinced me to quit was that I saw like 2 instances of founders who started businesses and in a month and a half surpassed everything that I had done in 6 years. And at that point, I had told myself, okay, I am not willing to put any more time into this. Just personally, like, I know that there exist better ideas that can succeed much faster. And my development roadmap is longer than they took to succeed. So it's like, I might as well just bail. So I think it really just comes down to what you want to do.
Are there things that you've seen, especially on Indie Hackers, like some interesting or innovative ways that makers have engaged with potential markets in order to try and like validate a problem that maybe you wouldn't expect?
Validating a problem.
Like
that's a good one.
Instead of building a whole thing, they've done this weird thing to try and just prove that there is an issue before they get started.
Yeah, there's all sorts of stories, and like everyone does this in different ways. Probably the most common thing is to not validate anything and just like put it out there.
Just do it.
Lucky. Some people are very meticulous about validating their ideas. Right. I talked to JT Marino. He's the founder of Tuft & Needle, which is like an online mattress company, and they bootstrapped their way to something like $300 million. Can't remember if it was like 300 million in revenue or if that's how much they got acquired for. One of those two. But their first test was simply like, hey, we are an unheard of brand. No one has ever bought a mattress from us. Hold on 1 second.
That's okay.
My mom's in town.
No worries.
So what's it called? Yeah, so essentially they put a mattress on a Google ad, I believe. They just put up an ad, a landing page, and they said, okay, will anyone even buy a mattress online? And they just paid a lot of money to get the top ranking for like mattress, and somebody bought a mattress for them. And that was like sort of their first hypothesis, is like, will people buy mattresses online from something they've never heard of? Like, that wasn't the only validation they had to do. Like, the next step was to go to Reddit and like try to figure out what people buy in mass, et cetera. I think that was like an interesting example of they sort of skipped to the end, right? Yeah. Like, let's pretend we actually had a mattress. They hadn't even made mattresses at that point, but they needed to make sure that they were on the right track, and they didn't want to waste 6 months sort of doing something that was going to be a dead end if they could prove it would be a dead end from day one. Yeah, cool. So just finally, I wanted to ask a bit about the acquisition by Stripe. How did that come about, and what went into your thinking when kind of considering that? How that came about was completely out of the blue. So for a few months before that, I had been selling ads to find indie hackers. That was sort of my plan. Like, okay, I've got a lot of traffic. How do I make money from traffic? By advertising. And I had sort of a list of like, who are my dream advertisers? And the very top of the list was Stripe. It's like, Stripe would be like the perfect advertiser for indie hackers. So therefore, I'm going to reach out to them last. I'm going to work my way up and try to figure out how to do sales. And then the last person I call will be Stripe. I was probably halfway through the list when I got an email from the founder of Stripe, Patrick, and he was like, the subject was acquire indie hackers from Patrick at stripe.com. So the second I read it, I was like, holy shit, this can't be real. Because it wasn't even on my radar that anyone would want to buy this like small indie site run by like one person that was barely making any money at all. And the email was very straightforward. He just asked if I would ever be open to being acquired by Stripe. And I said, yeah, we have to talk about it, but like, it sounds like it could be interesting. Because if you really think about like the situation that I was in, it was me spending about half my time every week selling ads for indie hackers, which
Yeah.
like, in my opinion, makes the site worse. Right? No one's like, oh, thank God the site has ads. Like it's way better now, right? So it's like, it's only half my week making the site better than half my week making the site worse, just like keep the lights on. It wasn't my favorite business model. I was looking into switching, but through an acquisition, Stripe could sort of fund indie hackers, keep the lights on, keep me like happy and healthy personally. They're very hands off. And so like people ask me, oh, how much has your life changed? And it's like very little. I'm still working in my apartment. You know,
Yeah.
I'm still working with my brother who's here as well. And still sort of making my own creative decisions on indie hackers and how to grow the community. But now it's a lot more secure. Stripe doesn't want to change the direction. Like the mission that I have, which is to inspire as many people to start these companies as possible, is also Stripe's mission. Because they're trying to sort of increase the GDP of the internet. And it's a win for I think indie hackers users as well, because now it's like the website that they like has got more resources going into it. And it's not going away anytime soon. So it was a very painless process. It was like literally like a weekend of talking to Patrick, and then like 2 or 3 weeks of like attorneys going back and forth.
Yeah.
And that was fun, hiring my own attorney for an acquisition. And you know, a month later I was at Stripe. That was April 2017. It's been almost exactly 2 years.
Cool. That's awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time and kind of going through this stuff with me.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Robert. I enjoyed answering your questions.
Alrighty. Take care.
You too.
Thanks.